Hello and welcome to VAM's Meet the Artist. This morning we are very lucky to be spending the morning with Paula Kovarik, and she is going to do a presentation, and afterwards I'll ask a couple of questions and then I'll open up questions to the group. Again, the reminders for this morning are to please mute your microphone. And again, we are recording, so if you do not wish to be included in the recording in terms of your video being up, you can turn your camera off. You'll still be able to see the event and hear it. We just won't see your picture up there. So with that, I have one other announcement. In September, Paula will be doing a workshop here. It'll be September 13, 14, 15. That's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Currently, the class is full. However, if you're interested, we are starting a wait list just in case things change for people. If you are interested, you could email education@visionsartmuseum.org and we could put you on the wait list. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Paula. Hi, Paula.
Hi, how are they? I see a lot of faces that I recognize and names that I recognize, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Should I just go right into this presentation, or do you want to go questions first? Or
why don't you go into the presentation?
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll do that.
Okay.
So as many of us have experienced, the COVID-19 year was kind of a challenge, and the past several years have been kind of a challenge for me in terms of trying to organize what all is inside me and let it come out. And so this is sort of how I felt, especially during COVID. Where there were so many things going on and so many things sort of buttoned up that I really wanted kind of a release. I'm known for my stitching, and this piece, the Do the Doodle piece, is very representative of the very beginning of my stitching, where I thought that I could use some of my drawings that I do sort of subconsciously in stitch, and just have some fun with it. So this is the kind of drawing that I like to do that really has no meaning, but also has a sense of environment and fun and mystery to it. I'm also in the process of exploring a new way of doing work by cutting up quilts that I've finished, and a lot of quilts that I've created over the past 15 years are have been cut up and will be cut up. This is a recycling process that I'm looking at very seriously in terms of why we make things and how we keep them and what worth do they have. And though I am very fond of many of my quilts, I also am fond of a process of taking them apart. So I've been taking those pieces apart and then restitching them, overstitching them with some of those same drawings that I've created in the past, creating a bulk and a movement to the pieces that make them almost sculptural. Morph is one of those that I think it's in the gallery now. This is a quilt made up of probably, I think there are 3 different quilts represented in there. My scraps are getting sort of mixed up, so they don't, I can't really identify them anymore. But I do have a number of quilts in this piece, and a lot of the fabric is canvas, cotton canvas, untreated canvas. I also do this stitching exercise as a meditation. This is called Pathways, and it's a 1-line path that I do with free motion stitching. From this one started in the middle and goes up and down the piece as sort of a willy-nilly stream of consciousness act. I use this particular process to go deep and go long. So I'm really not planning any of these stitches. I'm just stitching. And as I'm stitching, I react to the stitch before. So if I'm going up a line, I might see a flower, that one side of a flower, but then create the other side as I finish the next line. So this is pathways 2, I think, or pathways 3. And then this piece called It's Complicated is in the gallery too. This one has a number of one-line pathways and really focuses in on just all of the complications of what we are as human beings and also in the world. So I use these pieces. Sometimes I do these pieces, as I said, as a meditation, and sometimes they don't really work out, so I can use them as scraps. This piece was the back of a quilt until one day my computer went dead. And in the sort of panic I had of not having my safety, I don't know, my favorite toy, not available to me, I took the back of that quilt and I stitched it until it became warped. And so this is sort of a reaction, an emotional reaction to an event in life that felt like a great release. Sometimes I do pieces that are focused on a particular idea. This piece started with the idea of looking at details. And so I took a quilt top that I had just finished and I cut it up again into 1-inch squares and added 1-inch squares of fabric below it that sometimes contrasted, sometimes complemented the square above, and laid them out into a grid. And then took each square and stitched a little bitty detail into that square to hold the squares down onto a piece of fabric that I had on the backing. And this was sort of, it was about science experiments and looking at various data as you go through trying to solve a problem. So these are the data points. And the light blue one started looking like graph paper to me. So I added that stitch that would make it look more like graph paper. And then because knowledge has raw edges, I decided to throw it all into the dryer after getting it wet and letting it kind of deconstruct itself. And so this is right after I had taken it out of the dryer. This is the back of the piece. I use a drapery black lining for the back. It's got a really nice structure and it's really easy to stitch. So that it holds the pieces really solidly. And here's the finished piece. It's called Knowledge Has Raw Edges. I also do things like out of my comfort zone, and this was one of the comfort zones that really challenged me in 2019. I was invited to participate in a woodblock cutting exercise, and it was called a steamroller print workshop. So we were each given a 4x8 sheet of plywood that we could cut and make a wood block out of. You can see on the far left of this slide that there's a drawing, a black and white drawing of these kind of beasts. That was a Illustrator drawing that I did in my computer. Then, and the middle is the quilt top that I decided to make, that I was going to print that image onto. So, and then the far right is the wood block itself. We had 6 weeks, 3 times a week to work on our wood blocks. And then the next step was to put fabric down on a inked wood block. The wood block was inked and then fabric was put down on it and paper, and then a felt mat was put on top of it. You can see the quilt top that I put down on that inked block. on the right side, and the steamroller in the background ready to go. And here it goes, this one. And then each time we did a rollout of the quilt block, we then pulled it up. Oops, sorry.
Oh, I love that ice.
The reveals were always really exciting because each person had a different wood block, and we had lots of different styles. That I ended up pulling about 15 of these fabrics in that. And this, here it is in Quilt National after I stitched it. You actually have one in the gallery called Disruptors, and this one shows the front of that piece and then the back of the piece, and you can see the density of the stitching that I've added to it. Here's another piece that I had finished back in 2000. I think this was done in 2019, and I really didn't like it after I finished it. It felt kind of dead and uninteresting to me. So the best thing to do then is to cut it up. And I really like having raw materials of this nature because they're so interesting with their stitch. Here's what I did with those pieces. I created those 5 masks with the piece of the quilt and then created a new background. This was called Silos, and it's about the idea that we get our news from our own sources. 2020 was about making toys because I really needed some distractions. And so since we were the year of the mask, I thought masks would be the perfect metaphor for what we were experiencing in life. And I created a little pattern that pretty simple to put together, then used quilts to make the quilt. So these are a lot of, once again, cut up quilts that I had laying around, and the diversity was really fun to work with. Here's Otto and Bird. These guys are actually animated. If you pull their chains, their tongues wiggle. And this is the table that we have at the gallery right now of the toys that I created, with the exception of the big wooden thing. That is actually a cranky. It holds a 14-foot animated quilt that when you turn that knob on the cabinet, it rolls continuously. Pod lights. So right now I'm working on a number of different things. My bag of scraps is getting smaller, so I'm actually looking around at other quilts to say, where else can I find new raw material? But this bag of scraps is pretty big right now, and I can create things out of those scraps. This is a piece that was in process for the past month. The picture on the left with the Storm at Sea quilt pattern is made up of 2 different quilts, and the little collages next to it are pieces that I created out of other scraps using the same color palette and some of the same materials. So as I put them up on the design board, I started making one large composition out of them. Excuse me. And so here's some of the little minor compositions that I did out of pieces of quilts that I had laying around. And there was the one with the scalloped edge up at the top here is an old pillowcase that I had that I stitched on. There are a number of scraps of fabric that were stitched onto an army blanket. there's just lots of different things in these collages, and they're a lot of fun to do because they're not very big. And I can do one in a day and start accumulating them. So as I accumulated them, I started putting them together. Here's a detailed shot of how those pieces go together. I use a blanket stitch on my sewing machine. Other times I actually use a free motion stitch. You can see this red stitching on the left-hand side where the dark and the green come together. Those are free motion stitches holding those two colors together. And then the free motion stitching here with the grid of the black line is something that it actually stitches it down to the substrate that I'm using so that it's stable. But I'm not afraid of raw edges, and I kind of like the way that threads come sneaking out of the edge, and I feel like that texture is something that actually adds a dimension to the piece. And here's the end result. It comprises about, I think there are maybe 3 or 4 different quilts in this piece. I haven't named it yet. I haven't figured out what the name is, but it's very, very, very active when you come up to it. It's about 5 feet by 5 feet. So it dominates the room when it's hung. You can see the little pieces that I've done. You can see as I animate this, the little pieces that were done as collage and then added to the quilt as I was putting it together. I'm also experimenting with layering stitch and making dimension and transparency happen through stitch. This is a whole cloth quilt that I created. It took about maybe 5 days to do this. It's about 4.5 feet by 4 feet, maybe something like that. It's in the gallery. I can't remember the size. But so I started with those kind of round globular shapes and just stitched those down in white thread, and then added the grid on top of them of the rounded rectangles, just stitched right over the top of the original stitching so that there was a layer, and then identified areas within the intersections that could be filled with different varieties of stitch. So it has a lot of detail plus a sort of a implied transparency that I really like. I'm also experimenting with painting on cloth. This is, again, raw canvas. I really like the weight of it when I stitch. I'm wrapping thorns for some reason. I don't know why, but I have these thorns that a friend of mine gave me, and I decided that I had to wrap them. And I'm also experimenting with layering of stitch on these canvas pieces after they've been painted with ink and fabric paint. This is my isolation chamber. I made this last year also, and it's as you can see, about the size of my head when I'm in an expansive mood. It's a very quieting place, and I use it. I actually use it often. It's kind of odd, but I use it. Inside, there's a ribbon that goes around the inside. The inside is lined with lace, and the ribbon says, "Be calm, calm down, calm down." And that's what it does for me. So my studio is, you can see it in the background when I'm talking, but this is my home in Memphis. We live in a city of gardens and lots of things grow here. The tree coverage is, as you fly into Memphis, you barely see buildings because there's so many trees, and the varieties of greens are just stupendous. I just love this area. This is my studio in the backyard, the entryway, and you can see a little gazebo in the back where we have lunches and things like that. This is the entry room where you walk into the studio. It's kind of a staging area for things that I'm just contemplating or thinking about, or old pieces that need to be displayed for a while so I can remember what I was thinking when I made them. And if I turn around in that same room, you can see that there's a table and a hanging, my husband put a hanging device up at the top where I can hang quilts. to show them in that room. And then when you walk into the studio, it looks like this. The studio is really big and wonderful. We bought this house because of this studio. It was a photographer's studio. And we added the windows and doors and things like that so that I could work in here. I've got a little movie, but it's really kind of wobbly. So I wanted to warn you that you might get a little dizzy. So if you're standing in the room, this is right before I started sending things to Visions. A lot of the pieces that are on the walls there are pieces that needed to be kind of cataloged and thought about. You can see that quilt up at the top there. That's the quilt national quilt that is now cut up into, I don't know, maybe 150 pieces. I've used that quilt for many different pieces since then. This is the sewing station, and you can see I'm sort of into wrapping things. So I use toilet paper rolls and large tubes and wrap them with fabric. And there are the masks. I'm a true believer in bulletin boards. So my bulletin board is always full and I'm constantly adding to it. It's really interesting to me that it's layered. And if I could put it down on my sewing machine bed, I'd like to stitch it because it really represents a lot of my life, my babies and my sons and my grown-up family, and also various places we've lived. And it's just a table of memories. And I just really love having it around. This is the design board side of the studio. I have those floating walls on the design board that I can move to and fro to work on a specific piece or hide it away. And again, this is the sewing station with, you can see that bag of scraps here. In the background, that black and white piece is actually something that I'm experimenting with. I had Spoonflower print an illustration that I did with those black and white illustrations, and I'm creating collages out of them now. I have a website and a journal that I go to all the time. You might, if you subscribe to the journal here by pressing that button, you'll get an article from me maybe once every 2 weeks or so, or maybe once a month, or maybe you're lucky and you get it once a week. But most of that journal focuses on my process and kind of it's really a journal for me to remember what I'm thinking and also to spur myself on to do more work. But I find a lot of people are interested in process, so that's where I put it. And I just wrote a book, and it's called At Play in the Garden of Stitch. And these are thoughts while eyeing the needle. And it's a compilation of ideas, my process, some exercises, some stories of specific quilts. It's really just sort of a scrapbook of Paula Kovarik. So if you're interested in my work, I'd appreciate it if you would order that book. You can order it through your local bookstore or on Amazon. And this is the Instagram handle that I have, at Yellow Brick Studio. And I want to say thank you for your time. Really appreciate you listening to that.
Thank you, Paula. That was really wonderful. That was such a great journey through your studio and your process. And yeah, that was very wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I do have a couple questions. Paula and I had a really nice long conversation before we started the Zoom, and I'm going to try to pick up the rhythm of where we left off, even though I wrote these questions before talking to her, but, and it does address some of the things you just talked about, but maybe you can think about it and give us another response on it. So one of the first things is, when I first looked at your work in Raw and Reassembled, I was struck with this kind of lightness and whimsy. There's kind of this whimsical quality. And then the closer I looked, I began to see other things. And and started to raise questions for me. And I saw somberness and I saw heaviness. But that was sort of in contrast to, I'd say, the pervasive palette, the colors that you had used. So I was wondering if you chose the palette or if it kind of chose you. Were you using, merely what was in your bins, your recycling kind of bins, or did you kind of have an idea about how you wanted to use color to relay your stories here?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm specific about color, and I actually I don't use it very much, actually. A lot of my stitching is black and white. I intentionally try to make my quilts approachable in a whimsical way, but I'm always putting out a message that is deeper than the whimsy. So there are political statements, there are emotional statements. I find that line and shape can express what I feel deep inside, and the more I do it, the more things are coming out. This feeling of my honesty in my stitch. But I'm always looking for a way to let people in. And so I like the idea that when people first look at a piece, they see the general structure of it, but they have to move closer to see the stitch. And then when they see the stitch, that's when some of the more solid, more somber messages can come through, surrounded by this feeling of optimism and whimsy. So it's a delicate balance. I went through a couple of years back, 2018, I think 2016, where things were very, very dark. So I've let go some of that real darkness and came through now. But I'm concerned about lots of different issues, politics and environment and health issues. So I try to add that to the palette.
Yeah, thank you for that. I just saw a question pop up that actually related to my next question. Lisa Jenny from Washington posed this question, and my question was, had to do with, in many art disciplines, the actions that artists make to remove the preciousness from their work is really a powerful action, and a lot of times it has to do with deconstruction. So can you speak to what it feels like when you start cutting up your work and reassembling it? Lisa's question also, let me just interject really quickly. Lisa's question was, she was intrigued by the idea to cut up previously finished quilts. So I just wanted to include that. What does it feel like?
It's scary as hell, and exciting too. I find that cutting up my quilt, really it came from a feeling of like, why do I do this? Why do I make art with fabric? Why do I think that my work is precious? Why do I store them in this back room on piles? Why, all those whys came up in the past few years. And when I really, look deep inside, it really is for me about the process, not the product. I really feel seriously about the fact that as an artist, the process is what I'm looking for. I'm exploring that point where the thread and the fabric and my brain merge. So if I think about a quilt as being precious and I can't cut it up, then it becomes its own self. It doesn't belong to me anymore. And I don't particularly like the idea that it's sitting in my back room in a storage, a storage tube. So it really makes sense to me to reuse and use again those pieces that had, you know, great meaning to me when I made them, and that meaning comes through in the next piece and solidifies some of the things that I was thinking about in the first place, but also gives me a new way of looking at it and creating something new from where I am now. And that deconstruction is about that process. It's process, not product. So
That's,
every so often, because I'm a designer, I'm tempted into the lane of, oh, I should really market these things as sellable objects, and I should make little things that people can afford to buy, and I should do a product line, and and then I realize that that's not my goal. My goal is to be an artist and to be in process.
yeah, that's a great answer. And that really resonates with me and a lot of other people. I can tell by the chat that's popping up. You're with a lot of like-minded people here.
Well, and I should add one thing. I recommend it highly.
Yeah.
I really do. I think we take ourselves too seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing better than to take something that felt serious and important and took hours and hours of effort, and then cutting it up and creating something new out of it. Maybe not even creating something new of it, just cutting it up and seeing what that means and how that feels. It just sort of releases that penned in thing.
Yeah. And it really helps your creativity grow even more exponentially.
It does. Yeah. And I have to say that there's a lot of failures.
Yeah. That's okay. That's part of the process.
They too can be cut up.
Right. So another question I have, it's about when you're working. So, okay, there's something about thread and stitching and binding things together that really speaks to me on a deep, almost innate level. I really gravitate toward it. And when I look at your work, I'm struck by that deep kind of powerful energy. And I find that if I allow myself to fall into the work while looking at it, it's almost like I'm entering a magical realm. Like the more I look at it, the more I see. Even like the finished edges or the raw edges, you know, the thread, just the layers of it. It's just so rich.
Thank you.
So my question really is, what do you think about when you're working? Are you thinking about the technical aspects, or do you just have narratives spiraling out like a plate of noodles?
Yeah, well, when the narrative stops, that's when the stitching stops, and I have to get out my scissors and try to think like, oh no, how can I hang this? And sometimes I am thinking about the actual end product, but only in the regard of like when I put it up on the design board, what's the next step in the process? And sometimes the finishing process to me is an important detail that has to be done to make sure that it's, that it can be hung, and also that it has the amount of detail I need it to have to support its whole. So I think a good example of that is the Dark Heart piece, which is sort of looks like an eagle. It's yellow and black, and I don't know, it's a assemblage piece, and the edges of that are hand stitched and machine stitched with a variegated thread that really popped the edge to the point where I felt like that's what I want this thing to do. I want it to glow. So I feel like the things that I'm thinking about when I'm actually constructing pieces, when I'm putting compositions together, they go up and down the design board lots of times. And I layer things and relayer them and cut them apart and then relayer them again, so that I'm looking, and that's again, process, not product. And sometimes, I sort of stumbled upon 3D because one of the pieces that I was working on had a big bump in it. And it was either I stopped working on it or cut it apart to make it 2D, or let that 3D-ness come forward and play with that idea. So, you know, the piece can actually tell me where to go.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. I'm going to throw one last question at you before I open it up to everybody else. There are lots of questions coming through, but this is it's a short question.
Mhm.
I've talked with a lot of artists, and there's been kind of a commonality with people over this past year during lockdown. Many artists I know found it hard to create during lockdown. What kept you motivated?
Toys. Yeah, I really couldn't. I did do a lot of work last year, but I was floating, just as most people were, I think. But the toys that I started experimenting with, the hanging things, the experimental pieces, something that was completely new, brought my attention back to the work. I couldn't do a serious piece because things were too serious. So I was really focused on how can I make something that is challenging and also important to me as an artist, and but then make it accessible to me so I can come in. I work every day. I work from 8 to 4 every day. If I walk in here 8 to 4 and I have nothing on my mind, it's bad. It's a bad day. I find that those days I have to reorganize my fabric cabinet or sort out my thread rolls, or all the things that we all do when we can't think of something. But those toys really took my interest, and so I experimented with 3D forms, and I looked up a lot of things like origami, and can you do origami with quilted fabrics? There's a lot of things that I experimented with. So I find that the answer is find something new that challenges you in a new way, so you're not stuck in the same old way.
That's great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to open up to some of the raised hands here. Vanessa, did you happen to notice who was in the queue? I thought Chris Murphy was at first, and then maybe Mel Beach, but maybe I'm not seeing the hand in the right place. Nope, Chris says no. Oh, that was just my hand.
You know what? Mel Beach has a question, and Watama has a question that are pretty good questions.
Okay. Mel, do you want to read your question yourself, or do you want me to?
Sure. I was just curious about process again, whether you plan ahead using a sketchbook or a list of ideas, or do you just dive in onto fabric and thread and see what emerges?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Mel. With those one-line quilts that are just stitch and canvas, I have a pad of paper next to my TV chair in the evenings that I draw with a pen on paper, one-line drawings. So I just draw and draw and draw. Really, it's all stream of consciousness. It's really looking at, I might see a pattern that I want to imitate. It's not really a sketchbook. It's really not, you put the pen on the paper and you go, and you don't let go. You don't stop and start or erase or make it better or scribble. You just keep going on a path. So those quilts, though I never transpose those drawings to the quilt, I already have developed a vocabulary of stitch through the drawings. So I'll put my needle into the fabric and I will not stop. I'll just go. And I use some of the same, vocabulary, the same graphic vocabulary that I've established in my drawings. And with the cut up quilts or any kind of quilt where I'm doing piecing, I have never drawn one out. I can't think of one that I've drawn out. It's always a process of putting fabrics next to each other, cutting them into pieces, assembling them, recutting them, reassembling them, just do it as I sort of play with the board. So I might have a specific idea in mind, but I never draw that idea out.
Great, thank you for that. Watima, did you want to ask your question directly?
Sure, I'll ask it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you very much for the talk. I've also seen your work at Visions and was really struck by your use of line, and then reading up about you, realized you started as a graphic designer.
Yes.
And so I was curious about your path from graphic design, which I imagined was a lot of line on paper, to fiber art.
Yeah, well, graphic design has certainly informed my work. And I was a graphic designer, am a graphic designer. You just never stop being a graphic designer, I don't think. But I was in business as a graphic designer for over 30 years. So I was in the habit of creating design work because that's what my clients needed. But I tell people the difference is as a graphic designer, I am communicating somebody else's idea, somebody else's communication, somebody else's goal. And so I developed over those 30 years a really clear habit of listening carefully to what people were saying, and making sure that I understood their goal, because each client had a different product or goal or service or whatever. I had to almost become an instant expert in their field to be able to create the graphics that I was doing. Now I have the luxury of listening to myself as a client, which can be very difficult, I'll tell you. But that listening to myself is what the challenge is now, and how I can put my ideas into a visible, solid form. And the graphic design talents that I have been a lifesaver in terms of composition and using line and balance and things like that. But the challenge has always been the same, of listening carefully to what people need or what myself needs to do in the communication.
But I'm also curious to know, I mean, that's really interesting to know. I used to be a graphic designer too, and what I didn't like was that I was working to other people's ideas.
Yep.
So it's why I'm no longer a practicing graphic designer. But I also wondered about your path from working, I presume, with paper and ink to working with fabric and thread.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess, what was it, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that computers came around? I started as a graphic designer with ink and paper and board and drawing directly on the surface and handing those to printers to reproduce. So I learned the hard way of doing all that stuff, luckily. And then computers came around and it all became a little bit easier, because I could actually draw a perfect circle without having to use my ruling pen and a compass, which was really a wonderful thing. And then as that went on, a lot of the tools became much more sophisticated. So Photoshop and InDesign and all those Adobe programs really can lend a particular depth to design that was really wonderful for me. Creating artwork for press and printing is so much different than creating artwork for art. I'm thinking, when I'm creating things for the press, I'm thinking about color balance and details, and are the words spelled right, and all those details that my client expects of me. And when you print 20,000 brochures, you want every single one to be the same and perfect. So my attention to detail was honed very carefully during that period. I had a successful business, so I didn't hate my job as much as I felt privileged to have the opportunity to work on major projects. At the same time, it was hugely stressful. And when I sold my business, that relief period between running a business that was, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, to, oh, you're in your studio, now what are you going to do? Was a huge challenge and change for me. And I found that a lot of my first quilts were very graphic designy. They were very Bauhaus. They were very, very strict compositions that reflected my design training. And now I'm thankful that some of that stuff went away. Does that make it, is that a clearer answer for you?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Does anyone else have a question for Paula?
I have a comment. Thank you so much, Paula, for your tour. That was really fascinating to see in detail the space that you work in. And you're really lucky to have such a wonderful space.
Yes.
I wanted to comment, I did a docent tour last week in the museum. And I think most of the people on the tour, I'm not exactly sure of this, were traditional quilters. And they loved your work. They were completely fascinated by your process and your work. But when I described the process of you taking an award-winning quilt that had traveled around the United States and gone to all these fabulous venues, and then you cut it up into 4-inch pieces, everybody went into shock. It was like, oh my gosh. And so I think one of the benefits of seeing your work in person is to really open the mind to the possibility of getting even more creative with our work and detaching ourselves somewhat from the final product, knowing that we can use it in a different way. So I appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate you saying that.
Tara, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? There was something about thread weight.
Yes, hi, Paula. Thank you for a wonderful tour, and we love your work. And I was just mesmerized by all the stitching you do. And when I saw some of your pieces, I know are linear and nonstop, but there were several that had such clean finishes at the ends, like arrows. And I thought, how do you get the thread from not fraying? Because that seems to be my biggest bugaboo.
Yeah. Well, I use a 40 weight thread, and I use a 14 or a 16 top stitch needle. It has a larger eye in the needle. And when I come to those corners, I actually stop at the corner often, and then turn or move my fabric so that it will make the right angle turn. And I haven't had any trouble with fraying, and I think it's a matter of slowing down and anticipating the corner that will stop some of that. I have had some times where my thread will break, but it's because I'm going too fast, and the needle has been burred or something, or bent. So those are the things that I do. And that 40 weight thread, I use it in both the bobbin and the top thread. It has a weight to it that allows the thread to stand up on the fabric a little bit more. It doesn't go into the fabric as much. And so it's it's much more obvious because I'm doing that with a one-line stitch. I want to make sure people see it. So I experimented with standard 50 weight thread, and it was too subtle. So I went to a heavier weight, and I recommend it. I use the YLI brand. It's a really strong thread, long staple cotton, 40 weight, which is, my go-to thread. Does that make it clear
Yeah.
enough? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Mhm.
Mel, do you want to ask that next question?
Sure. I was curious again, what is the criteria for which quilts you were ready to cut up to? Is it a color? Is it the patterning? And are there any quilts that are off limits, at least for now, from being
Yeah,
cut?
there's a few that are off limits. They might be hanging in that museum right now, but not. I guarantee none of them will live forever. I think sometimes I'm looking for color. Sometimes I'm looking for line. Sometimes I'm just darn tired of it. And, a lot of my earlier quilts got cut up, things that, at the time were, oh my God, I'm so good. This is revolutionary. They aren't so much that, they don't have that life range. So, yeah, and I use what comes to me too. So I've actually, a couple of my friends have given me old quilt tops that they don't want anymore. And so I'm starting to use other people's quilted fabric. It's a little odd using somebody else's work because it doesn't feel like me. So I haven't figured out how to make that work yet, but yeah, it's a combination, and mostly they're pieces that I'm just tired of. I just don't want to look at them anymore.
Great. Marion, would you like to ask your question? Excuse me.
There, I unmuted. Hi, Paula. Hi.
Hi, nice
I
to
know
see
you
you.
use a domestic machine,
Yes.
which is astounding. And I was wondering if you used a long arm, would that change your work? How would that change your work?
I really debated long and hard about a long arm because, of course, it's much more free. You don't have to worry about the arm getting in the way. But I spent, 10 years sitting at a chair, moving my fabric through that arm. And I developed skills that when I tried to convert to a long arm at, I had a couple of friends have long arms, and I went over and tested them. I was not comfortable standing up and having all that freedom. I kind of like the constraint that I have.
Mhm.
And I don't find that my constraint is in any way affected what I want to do with the stitch. So I'm pretty happy with this, plus I don't have to buy one of those things. They're so expensive.
It's more intimate when you're hugging your machine.
It is. And I joke because sometimes I really have to suit up sometimes because I do spend hours and hours stitching at a time. And I have an elbow pad that's made out of sheepskin that I put on my elbow. And sometimes I wear a neck brace because, you're kind of like this all day. So, I have to continually remind myself to stand up or sit up and stretch. It's not for the faint of heart.
That's important stuff. I knew somebody who would set a timer in their studio and every 20 minutes get up and do one stretch just so they wouldn't kind of cramp up. I think we have time for maybe one more good question, maybe two short ones. Does anyone else have a question? Nope. All right.
I had a question. I can't raise my hand because I'm not visible.
Okay, go ahead.
How does the mechanism work for the tongues that wag, or the whatever that wooden box was? What do you have inside of there?
If you saw what the mechanism was, you would think she's crazy. It's a little clamp that looks like it's like a C-clamp, and it has a wine cork in it that I threaded the line through, and then made a little spring that would allow it to go up and down as you pull it. So the cork at the top keeps the head from coming in, and the spring allows the tongue to go up and down. The tongue is clasped with a one of those paper clip things, you know, the alligator clips. It's really rickety and silly, you know. It's just like, well, I needed to do this, so how do I make that work? And so it's a combination of things, and you know, whatever's laying around, I'll try to make it work. I wish I was an engineer, but that's another life.
You're kind of an engineer if you figured out how to use the seat.
I figured it out. Yeah. It's goofy.
Paula, we've got another quick question here from Naomi. Naomi, do you want to ask yourself, or do you want me to go ahead and read it for you?
You can go ahead.
Oh, okay. Naomi is wondering, had you been a sewer as a child or young adult that led you to this method of expressing your emotion?
Well, not so much the emotion, but my clothing. I was always a teeny tiny little girl. And, you know, when I was in high school, that teeny tininess translated to there was nothing in my size that looked like I was a grown up. So I learned how to sew my own clothes so that I could be on trend and not feel like I was, you know, wearing little pinafores. So my mother taught me how to sew, and I made a lot of my clothes in high school. And that's where it all started. But I've always had a sewing machine around, you know, to make curtains and household goods and things like that. I never really used it as an art tool until about 15 years ago.
Okay, great. I think we have time for 2 more questions. We've got one from Lisa Jenny and one from Chris Murphy.
Okay.
Lisa, do you want to go first?
No, go you. Just leave it up.
Oh, okay. I'll just read it for you. Lisa was wondering if you had thought of using a sit-down long arm, such as a Bernina Q20.
Yeah, you know, those were really, really, really tempting. And I have a Bernina 740. And when I was at the Houston Quilt Show determining which one I was going to buy, that G20 was too expensive. So I bought the 740. And you know, one thing I like about the 740 is that, I'm not sure about the Q20, is that I think the Q20 was a straight stitch machine. Is that right? Do you know? We're not dead. Anyway, I thought it was a straight stitch machine. So I found that I like occasionally doing zigzags. And I will do free motion with zigzags sometimes because it gives extra wobble to my stitch. And so, you know, having that ability, those straight stitch, I have a straight stitch machine. I have a Brother 1500 that I can do free motion quilting on, but having the ability to put a zipper in or do zigzags or use a decorative stitch is important to me.
Great. Thank you for that. Chris, this is going to be our last question. Chris, you have a question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have 2 questions. Number 1, where did you get your neck brace?
I made it.
Did you?
Yeah. It's basically a tube with a layer of wool batting and a layer of kind of a stiffener. So it's got wool batting. There's a stiffener, like a interfacing in the middle, wool batting both sides, and then it's I think I used flannel around and just made a big tube, and then it's got Velcro closing. So
And
I made it fine. Sorry?
And that will stay stiff, so it doesn't just end up bending in front?
It reminds me to stay stiff.
Ah, okay.
It doesn't keep my neck in the same position. It just reminds me that I better keep my neck straighter.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I used one that I could buy from the Walgreens, and it was much too stiff. I felt like I was in a straitjacket. So
Okay, and the other question I asked was, so when you're putting pieces of already constructed quilts together,
Mhm.
are you doing piece on piece and then just attaching the top piece to the
I do
bottom
it.
piece?
I do
Or-
it. Yeah, I do it in many different ways. So
Yeah.
most of the time I am just butting them together and stitching
Ah.
down the ditch with a decorative stitch or with a free motion stitch. So I'm just butting them together. If the quilts are thin enough and I can seam them, I will do that so that there's actually seam.
Okay.
But if the quilts are like some of my quilts are on canvas and they have wool batting, they're pretty fat. So budding them
okay.
is what will keep them together.
Okay.
So, and sometimes I'll just use like a line of white glue or I'm trying to think of the word. It's crazy. Matte medium on the edge,
Mhm.
which is a artist tool. Matte medium is basically like glue really, and just put it on the edge and it'll stop the fraying. But sometimes I don't care if it frays. I like the fraying.
Okay.
And then other times I'm actually stitching them to a surface.
Okay.
And oftentimes I'll use drapery lining for that surface because it's a fairly stable fabric. So I stitch it to the surface and then I will stitch the two pieces together with whatever stitching seems appropriate to
Okay.
bring the two diverse elements together. So I might do a continuous stitch that's already on one of them across the other, or create a new layer stitching. Yeah.
Thank
So
you
there's,
very much.
I've used, I don't know, 6 or 7 different ways of doing it, but
Well,
only
thank you.
trial and error. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. And Paula, thank you so much for all of your thoughtful answers.
You're
to
welcome.
questions.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy the show if you're in California. I can't wait to see it myself and hope to see some of you in September.